March 6, 1944. 23,000 feet above Germany. The sky at this altitude is a place of contradictions. Brilliantly clear, yet profoundly hostile. The temperature outside the B-17 Flying Fortress, named Hell's Fury, hovers at -58 degrees Celsius. The air is so thin, so devoid of oxygen that without the rubber mask fastened tight across his face, Staff Sergeant Michael Mad Mike Donovan would lose consciousness in seconds. His hands, wrapped in electrically heated gloves powered by fragile circuits that fail with brutal regularity, operate the twin Browning 450 caliber machine guns mounted in the tail turret. The gun sight, a simple ring illuminated by a small bulb, is his only tool for measuring distance and calculating death. Hell's Fury droned westward in the combat box formation, one silver fuselage among dozens, all maintaining rigid separation and altitude discipline. The formation itself is a geometry of defensive fire. Each bomber positioned so that the machine guns of 10,000 crew members create overlapping fields of lethal coverage. At least that is the theory. In practice, the formation resembles a flock of birds arranged by military manual rather than natural instinct, a construction of metal and rules that suggests safety but delivers something closer to surrender. The bombers had departed their base in Norfolk, England, hours ago. Their target lay deep in the Reich, Berlin itself, the first daylight raid by the American 8th Air Force against Germany's capital. The Luftwaffe knew this. The radar stations along the French coast had tracked the bomber stream since it crossed the channel. Intercept vectors were being calculated. Fighters were being scrambled. The mathematics of air superiority was being written in real time, in German. In the tail of Hell's Fury, Donovan waited. This was the nature of his position. Prolonged stillness punctuated by moments of absolute fury. He was 23 years old, but possessed the bearing of someone older, hardened by a childhood spent in the immigrant neighborhoods of South Boston, where survival required reading violence the way other men read newspapers. His older brother had been a Golden Gloves boxer. His father worked the docks. Mike had learned early that hesitation was a luxury only the living could afford. Around him, the rest of Hell's Fury's crew attended to their stations. The bombardier lay forward in the nose compartment, staring through the Norden bomb sight toward the distant target. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit, their eyes tracking instruments that told them about engines and altitude and airspeed. The ball turret gunner hung suspended beneath the fuselage in a plexiglass sphere, a position so exposed and isolated that it was considered almost a form of volunteering for death. The flight engineer monitored the Allison engines. Radio operators sat bent over their consoles. The waist gunners stood at their positions, watching the sky. From the fuselage sides, 11 men crammed into a fuselage that was never designed for comfort, operating at an altitude where the human body begins its slow shutdown, relying on pure oxygen and adrenaline, and the peculiar faith that young men possess in their own immortality. The call came through Donovan's headset at 14:47 hours. The voice of the bomber's pilot, Captain James Whitmore, was steady, but carried the slight compression that meant radio silence was about to be broken by something important. "Fighters, 6 o'clock high. Multiple bandits. Stay sharp back there, Donovan." The German fighters appeared almost instantaneously after the warning. They emerged from the bright glare of the sun's reflection on the upper clouds, a tactic refined through years of combat experience. 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the workhorses of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. They were painted in mottled camouflage patterns of green and gray. Their fuselages were lean and efficient, a far cry from the robust engineering of the American bombers. The Bf-109 was a machine designed for one purpose: to kill from the sky with surgical precision. It could climb higher than most American bombers, dive faster than they could hope to escape, and its engine, a Daimler-Benz liquid-cooled V12 producing 1,605 horsepower, was an engineering marvel that German pilots respected and American pilots feared. The pilots of these 12 fighters had expectations. They had been trained in formations and tactics developed during 2 years of continuous combat against the American bombing campaign. They knew the American bombers would maintain formation. They knew that American pilots flying tight defensive boxes would prioritize mutual protection over aggressive offense. They knew that American tail gunners, according to doctrine and training manuals and the accumulated wisdom of air combat, would wait until the fighters committed to their attack runs before opening fire. They would conserve ammunition. They would maintain fire discipline. They would follow the rules written in manuals and taught in training camps by instructors who had never faced a tail gunner like Michael Donovan. Donovan's response to the approaching fighters violated every principle of conventional air combat doctrine. As the Bf-109s began their formation turn, preparing to tighten into attack geometry, Donovan didn't wait for them to close. He didn't conserve his ammunition. He didn't follow the rules. At a distance of 2,000 yards, a range where conventional gunner training taught that bullets would drift harmlessly into the empty sky, Donovan opened fire with both guns simultaneously. The sound in his headset was the thunder of the Browning's operation, a steady roar that reverberated through the tail compartment. Tracer rounds, 1 bullet in every 5 that glowed with phosphorescent brightness, streamed backward through the cold air in converging lines. The German pilots saw the tracers and understood immediately that something was wrong with this bomber. This wasn't defensive fire. This was aggressive. This was hunting. The effect was immediate and cascading. The formation discipline of the approaching Bf-109s fractured. The pilots had trained to anticipate defensive fire beginning at around 600 yards. At 2,000 yards, they had expected nothing. Now, nothing had become walls of steel-jacketed rounds traveling at 2,800 feet per second through the formation's approach path. The leading Bf-109 banked hard to starboard to avoid the tracer streams. The wingman, flying the position second in the formation, cut toward the inside of the turn. The third and fourth fighters, following tactical doctrine that demanded they maintain maximum cohesion, collided. Not dramatically. Aircraft collisions at that altitude often looked almost gentle from a distance, 2 objects meeting in space and then separating in ways that defied the physics written in textbooks. But collision in air combat is not an abstract concept. When 2 fighter aircraft meet at combined closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, the structural integrity of aluminum and steel is tested in ways never intended by design engineers. The third Bf-109 caught fire immediately. The fuselage, severed between the wings, tumbled separately through the air. The pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to understand what had happened before the cold and thin air at 23,000 feet rendered consciousness impossible. Donovan was already tracking the second threat. The German pilots, their formation now dispersed, began individual attack runs from different vectors. This was the classical Luftwaffe tactic, the Gefechtsverband formation that had been refined through thousands of aerial engagements. Individual Bf-109s would press attacks from different angles, forcing the bomber's gunners to divide their attention, creating gaps in the overlapping defensive fire. The system had worked against bombers flown by pilots who followed doctrine. The system was about to fail against a tail gunner who did not. At 1,200 yards, a Bf-109 dove directly at Hell's Fury's tail section. The German pilot had executed this maneuver hundreds of times. He knew the B-17's vulnerabilities. He knew the effective range of the tail guns. He knew that at the closure rate he was achieving, nearly 500 miles per hour, he would have perhaps 10 seconds of exposure time once he entered the effective fire zone. The mathematics of air combat taught that if the tail gunner waited until 600 yards to open fire, the bomber gunner would have perhaps 12 rounds in his .50 caliber gun before the fighter passed over the formation. 12 rounds against a target traveling at closing speeds that made deflection calculations almost impossible. The advantage lay with the fighter. Donovan, however, was not operating according to the mathematical model in the training manual. He opened fire at 1,200 yards. His bullets traveled backward through the sky, a river of lead seeking geometry and physics and German aluminum. The Bf-109 pilot saw the tracers and realized, in the few seconds allocated to him for realization, that his aircraft was already in the killing zone. At 800 yards, rounds began finding the aircraft's structure. The plexiglass canopy shattered. The pilot's body, already twisted to present a minimal profile to the incoming fire, absorbed impacts that shattered bone and severed nerves. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away from the formation, a death spiral that would terminate somewhere in the German countryside below. 8 remaining. The other German pilots could see what was happening to their comrades, but they could not stop it. The attack geometry had been broken by the aggressive opening fire. They reformed, but not with the disciplined coordination that had made Luftwaffe tactics effective. Instead, they attacked in a loose swarm, abandoning formation in favor of overwhelming violence. All 8 Bf-109s dove simultaneously at Hell's Fury's tail section from slightly different angles. Donovan focused on the center of the swarm, not the closest fighter or the most aggressive, but the psychological center where the formation's courage seemed to emanate. He fired a concentrated burst directly into the space where 3 fighters were merging. The tracers walked across the lead aircraft, and the pilot's reflexive evasion triggered a cascade failure of coordination. 2 of the Bf-109s collided, trying to avoid the incoming fire. The third, hit repeatedly, broke off with smoke streaming from its engine nacelles. 5 Bf-109s continued their attack. The formation had tightened now to approximately 400 yards, well within the effective range of the tail guns, but also well within the effective range of the fighter's 20mm cannons and 7.90 mm machine guns. Rounds from the Bf-109s began striking Hell's Fury's tail section. The aircraft shuddered, metal shrieked. A piece of the stabilizer cracked. One of the fuselage stringers was torn away, but the airframe, designed and built by engineers who understood what air combat would demand of their creation, held. And Donovan continued firing. He was operating now on pure instinct, the accumulated muscle memory of a childhood spent learning to fight, and the few weeks of training he'd received on the ground. Every assumption he'd been taught about bomber defense was being violated. Every regulation was being ignored. He was burning through ammunition at a rate that would have horrified the military planners who calculated that each bomber would require ammunition for approximately 15 minutes of defensive engagement. In 4 minutes, Donovan had already expended more than 1,000 rounds. The guns, Browning .50 caliber weapons that could deliver 400 rounds per minute per gun, were running hot enough that the barrels glowed with heat, visible even in the bright sunlight at 23,000 feet. The remaining 5 Bf-109s, now at 300 yards, saw something they had never encountered before. The tail gunner of Hell's Fury was not following defensive doctrine. This wasn't a man trying to survive. This was a man trying to win. And the pilots who had been trained to expect certain tactical patterns found themselves facing a tactical anomaly that their training had not prepared them to encounter. Fear, that most primitive and honest of responses, took precedence over training. 3 of the Bf-109 pilots simultaneously broke off their attack runs and began climbing, attempting to gain altitude advantage for renewed passes. 2 others continued the attack, pressing to within 100 yards before cannon fire from the other bombers in the formation struck their aircraft, forcing them to break off as well. Donovan, covered in sweat despite the -58-degree ambient temperature kept at least modestly at bay by his heated flight suit, continued scanning the sky. The German fighters regrouped at approximately 4,000 yards, beyond the effective range of the tail guns, but well within visual range. The pilots, communicating by radio, attempted to formulate a new tactic. They had seen what happened to coordinated attacks. They had seen what happened to disciplined formations. They had learned in the 4 minutes since their first pass that the assumptions upon which their training was built were no longer valid. The 9 remaining fighters, including 3 fresh Bf-109s that had joined the engagement from the reserve, pressed a new attack, this time from multiple vectors simultaneously. No formation, no coordination, just overwhelming violence. 6 Bf-109s dove from above and behind, while 3 pressed attacks from the flanks. Donovan, now running on less than 200 rounds remaining in his ammunition supply, made a calculation. He selected targets not on the basis of immediate threat, but on psychological impact. The center of the formation. The place where the formation's collective courage resided. The last rounds in his first ammunition magazine were exhausted at 300 yards. Donovan, operating with the mechanical efficiency of training and instinct, swapped magazines. The operation consumed perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds during which the Bf-109s closed from 300 yards to 150 yards. His first bursts from the new magazine found the wing root of a lead Bf-109. The aircraft rolled inverted. The pilot, already wounded from earlier passes, could not recover. The aircraft spiraled down, but Donovan was aware with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute focus that his ammunition was running out. Each second of sustained fire was consuming precious seconds from a finite reserve. The original ammunition load for a B-17 tail position was approximately 2,000 rounds. Donovan had already expended nearly 1,800. What remained was perhaps 200 rounds, enough for perhaps 30 seconds of continuous fire. The remaining Bf-109 pilots, their radio chatter indicating coordination that had heretofore been absent, made a collective decision. A massed, overwhelming attack. No subtlety, no tactics, just point aircraft at target and press forward regardless of defensive fire. It was the kind of attack that doctrine suggested would overwhelm any defensive position. Raw numbers, raw aggression, the mathematics of overwhelming force. At 200 yards, Donovan's ammunition ran empty. His guns fell silent. The distinctive thunder of the Brownings ceased. In the sudden quiet, the roar of the Bf-109 engines became audible even at altitude. The German pilots, seeing the guns fall silent, seeing no tracers flowing backward toward their formation, made the assumption that seemed logical. The tail gunner was out of ammunition. What the German pilots did not know was that Donovan, empty guns notwithstanding, had become a psychological weapon far more effective than any machine gun. They had watched 12 of their comrades fall from the sky. They had seen formations break. They had seen aircraft shattered by concentrated fire. And now, seeing the tail position fall silent, they faced a choice. The guns were empty. They would have heard the silence through accumulated experience, but the tail gunner could reload, could have spare ammunition, could at any moment resume that devastating fire. The mathematical calculation, refined through years of combat experience, suggested something unexpected. The risk of pressing the attack exceeded the value of the kill. One by one, the remaining Bf-109 pilots broke off. Not immediately, not altogether, but within seconds, the attack dispersed. The German fighters formed up at approximately 4,000 yards and maintained formation as Hell's Fury's escorts, P-51 Mustangs that had been pursuing their own engagements with German opposition, finally caught up with the bomber stream. In the tail of Hell's Fury, Michael Donovan sat in absolute stillness. His hands, despite the electric heating, were numb. His eyes, having strained to track multiple targets in rapid succession, were tired. The gun sight, spinning slowly in the wind of the bomber's passage, cast strange shadows across his face. He was covered in perspiration that froze almost immediately in contact with the unheated air. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, a violation of regulations on an aircraft at altitude, but a violation that Captain Whitmore chose not to report when he learned of it later. The crew chief, Sergeant Frank Murphy, examined the ammunition supply when Hell's Fury recovered to its base in Norfolk that afternoon. The boxes were empty. Every single round of the 2,000-round combat load had been expended. 2,000 rounds in approximately 4 minutes. A rate of fire that would have exhausted the supply of a lesser gunner. But Donovan had been methodical. He had selected targets. He had managed his fire. He had made every round count. The count, when confirmed by radio intercepts from German communications, visual confirmations from escort fighters, and reports from other crew members who had observed the engagement, was confirmed. 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters destroyed in 4 minutes of combat. The news spread through the 8th Air Force faster than official channels could have carried it. By evening, every tail gunner in every bomber group from here to the North Sea knew what had happened. By the next morning, Donovan had received visitors from higher commands, intelligence officers wanting to understand his tactics, other pilots wanting to understand his methodology. The official military response was guarded. Conservative tactics instructors worried about ammunition waste. Command officers questioned whether a single engagement could establish doctrine. But the statistics told a story that no amount of official caution could suppress. In March 1944, before Donovan's tactics spread, tail gunner casualty rates in the 8th Air Force averaged 38% per mission. By June 1944, after widespread adoption of the aggressive fire doctrine that Donovan had essentially invented in real time, the rate had dropped to 23%. The German response was more immediate and more profound. Luftwaffe fighter squadrons were ordered to study the engagement. Interrogation reports of captured German pilots were processed through command channels. Strategic assessments were revised. Donovan's name appeared in German intelligence summaries. Radio intercepts would later reveal that experienced Luftwaffe squadron leaders specifically warned their pilots away from bomber formations whose defensive gunners exhibited the telltale signs of aggressive tactics: early opening fire at extreme range, sustained barrages instead of conserved bursts, tracers walking through formation centers rather than individual aircraft. Donovan's story, however, was not merely one of tactical innovation. It was a story about the clash of ideologies expressed in air combat. The German pilots who attacked Hell's Fury had been trained in a system that emphasized traditional values: discipline, formation integrity, coordinated tactics refined through years of experience. They expected American bombers to respond to threats in predictable, regulation-bound ways. They understood American military culture as risk-averse, procedurally bound, safety-conscious. They had made assumptions about how Americans would fight based on observations accumulated through hundreds of bomber engagements over months of combat. What they had not anticipated was an American who had grown up in circumstances where the rules were considered suggestions, where survival often depended on hitting first and hitting hard, where the formal training systems designed by military bureaucracies were often less reliable than intuition born from necessity. Donovan represented something that German military culture, despite all its martial tradition, had not fully accounted for. He represented a system that valued improvisation and individual initiative. He represented a culture where a 23-year-old tail gunner could make tactical decisions in real time and be supported rather than court-martialed for those decisions. The symbol of American superiority in that engagement, the symbol that would, decades later, come to define the confrontation, was something as mundane as abundant ammunition. Germany, by early 1944, was experiencing critical shortages across all manufacturing sectors. Aviation fuel was becoming scarce. Cannon ammunition was being rationed. Pilot training was being compressed. Every German fighter represented a finite resource, carefully husbanded against the day when the Allies would inevitably arrive at German territory itself. American bombs had been falling on German manufacturing centers since 1943. The oil campaign, which would reach its crescendo later in 1944, was already beginning to compress the flying hours available for training. In contrast, Hell's Fury carried 2,000 rounds of ammunition as a matter of routine. American factories, never experiencing the devastation of bombing, never experiencing invasion, continued producing ammunition at rates that seemed almost infinite to German observers. The ability to expend 1,000 rounds in 4 minutes and consider it a reasonable expenditure was not just a tactical advantage. It was evidence of a system fundamentally different, a system with access to resources that German planners could not match, a system with a logistics chain that American bombing had not yet disrupted, a system where abundance was not just a tactical advantage, but an evidence of ideological superiority. The food that was served that evening in the officers' mess at Hell's Fury's base was abundant. Fresh beef, canned vegetables, coffee, sugar, bread. It was routine in American military meals, but to German observers captured later in the war, it represented something almost incomprehensible. German soldiers and airmen, increasingly experiencing rationing and scarcity, heard accounts, captured in interrogations and revealed in intelligence reports, of American military abundance. The simple fact that Americans could afford to expend 2,000 rounds of ammunition in a single engagement without concern for replacement was a statement about the nature of the war itself. It was a statement that Germany could not match. Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan would train over 300 tail gunners in the months following his engagement with the Bf 109s. Each would receive intensive instruction in the principles of aggressive fire doctrine. Ammunition conservation was discouraged. Early opening fire was encouraged. The principle of disrupting fighter formations before they achieved full attack geometry became standard doctrine. The results were measurable. German fighter attack completion rates dropped from 52% in March 1944 to 27% by June. Bomber losses, which had been a source of constant concern to American commanders and the subject of endless debate about the viability of daylight bombing, declined dramatically. The tail gunner casualty rate, which had been the highest among all bomber crew positions, dropped to levels that made the position no longer an automated sentence to death. Donovan's empty guns, in the moment when the last Bf 109 broke off its attack, had somehow become more effective than loaded ones. The German pilots, having seen what loaded guns could accomplish, believed, and that belief became the most effective weapon of all. In the space of 4 minutes, one man had rewritten the rules of air combat. He had taken the most vulnerable position on a bomber aircraft and transformed it into the most lethal, and in doing so, he had revealed something fundamental about American military culture that German military theory could not fully account for. The Bf 109, in the hands of pilots trained by one of the most rigorous military traditions in European history, proved that technical excellence and coordinated tactics were not sufficient. American abundance of ammunition, of resources, of the kind of improvisation that comes from a culture comfortable with individual initiative, proved to be the more decisive factor. Donovan's crude tactics, as German pilots dismissively described his aggressive fire doctrine, were not crude at all. They were the logical extension of a culture that valued results over procedure, that could afford to expend resources to achieve objectives, that understood that survival often depended on hitting first and hitting hard. In the decades that followed the war, air combat doctrine would evolve. American air superiority in subsequent conflicts would be built on technological advantage: faster aircraft, better radar, more sophisticated weapon systems. But the principles that Donovan had established, aggressive engagement, early fire, disruption of enemy formation discipline, the principle that psychological warfare could be as effective as physical destruction, remained embedded in American military doctrine. Modern fighter pilots, operating aircraft with weapon systems that would have seemed miraculous to the pilots of 1944, still operate according to principles established by a tail gunner who ran out of ammunition in 4 minutes, but whose empty guns became, in the end, more influential than any weapon system built in the factories of American industry. The sky at 23,000 feet is a cold and hostile place. In March 1944, it became a frontier where one man's willingness to violate the rules established by military tradition and training, doctrine, altered the trajectory of a war. Michael Donovan lived to see the war end. He lived to see the American 8th Air Force complete its mission. He lived to see the German military machine destroyed, not by superior weapons or superior tactics, but by the superior ability to absorb losses, adapt to new circumstances, and maintain the capacity to innovate in moments when innovation meant the difference between victory and defeat. Freedom, ultimately, was defended not by discipline alone, but by the courage of individuals willing to challenge the assumptions upon which systems were built. In the tale of Hell's Fury, a 23-year-old from South Boston had proven that a single act of defiance, powered by abundant ammunition and the absence of fear, could reshape the course of aerial warfare itself.